Okay. Hi, I am Naomi Firestone Teeter, Jewish Book Council's Executive Director, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's program, A Unique Portrait, Jeffrey Rosen and Dahlia Lithwick on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, presented along with our JBC Network organizations, JBC's partners in presenting over 1,200 Jewish literary events over the next year. You can find a link in the chat to find out more information about these wonderful organizations and the programs they have planned for you over the coming months. During the pandemic, we have found deep meaning in our virtual literary events and highlighting authors who contribute to our understanding of Jewish life and identity through their work. And we know that many of you have also turned to literature to guide you through this challenging moment. Thank you for being with us, for being a reader, and for being a part of our community. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate, enrich, and strengthen the community through Jewish literature. Visit jewishbookcouncil.org to learn about JBC's reviews, essays, and literary journal, Paper Brigade, our book club resources and author tours, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards and Natan Notable Books. I hope you would check out all of our programs and resources and consider becoming a member to support all of JBC's continued initiatives. Without further ado, as I know we're all anxious to begin here, I would like to welcome JBC's Network Director, Suzanne Swift, who will kick us off this evening. Thank you, Suzanne, for everything in this planning process.
Thank you, Naomi. Chag Sameach, everybody. I hope you've had a wonderful holiday season so far. In addition to the thanks that Naomi already said, I'd also like to thank Carolyn O'Keefe of Henry Holt for helping us put this event together. I also, again, want to thank all of our network sites for the incredible job they're doing this season as we all had to switch to this virtual world, for working together with us and to have this event. And now I want to introduce our speakers tonight. Jeffrey Rosen is the author of nonfiction books, in addition to his recently published book, Conversations with RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and the Law, which is what we are featuring tonight. He has written books on Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. He's the president and chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center and a law professor at George Washington University, and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of the New Republic and a staff writer for the New Yorker. Dahlia Lithwick is a senior editor at Slate, and in that capacity has been writing their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns since 1999. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post, New Republic, and Commentary, along with other places. She's the host of Amicus, Slate's award-winning bi-weekly podcast about the law and the Supreme Court. She's a Newsweek legal columnist. She was a Newsweek legal columnist from 2008 and 2011. We also want to remind you that to click on our link in the chat for the purchase of Jeff's book, you'll see that coming up in the chat. I know these are very short descriptions because you guys have amazing bios, but I want to thank you, and I'm turning it over to the both of you. We really look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and welcome, friends. It is so meaningful to convene with my dear friend Dahlia to remember our dear friend and a great American hero, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Dahlia and I both had the privilege of knowing Justice Ginsburg and of being her friend. And we miss her very much. And we have talked about her over the past years. This is the first time we've convened since she passed. And I feel, Dahlia, that this is kind of like a Shiva, really, because I know we're both still grieving the loss of Justice Ginsburg. And I'm so looking forward to our conversation tonight because I would like to talk with you about what made her so great and why she was so dear to us and what we learned from her, because I know she continues to inspire us each day with her shining example, and also why she is one of the greatest figures for constitutional change of our time. So thank you so much for joining, and really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I want to wish everybody who's tuning in a happy new year, a healthy new year, and the opportunity soon to be with the folks you love, not on a Zoom, which I think Jeff and I are beginning to think is reality, living in these boxes, but I know it is not. And I want to add my thanks to JBC for convening this, and I want to add to Jeff's note that this is a tough conversation, I think, for both of us, both because it felt as though we only had a minute to grieve, and then we were sort of suddenly launched into a very political conversation. And I have been looking forward to this time to actually do without the valence of politics and anger and partisanship, to do justice to the justice. And so it's really a treat to be here. Jeff, I think I want to just start by asking you, and we should note, folks, put your questions in the Q&A. Jeff and I are going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we are going to take your questions. So please, please don't hesitate to put any questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Jeff, I want to start by asking you the question I think everyone's wondering. It's where your book starts. We are all probably going to tell our grandchildren where we were when we heard Justice Ginsburg died, and probably a lot of us were just digging into the round challah on Rosh Hashanah. But can you talk a little bit about how you met Justice Ginsburg? Start us at the beginning. Talk about the first time you ever had a conversation with her, which seems like a much easier way into this slightly more difficult conversation.
It is, although it was not an easy conversation at the time. As you know, Dahlia, it was a long time ago. It was in 1991, and I was a young law clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and she was on that court, and I was clerking for another judge. And I met her a few months into the term in an elevator in the courthouse. She was coming down from a jazzercise class. Even then, she was a formidable exerciser, and she was coming down from the courthouse gym. And in the elevator, she maintained the Sphinx-like silence, the sort of Zen-like serenity that you and I have come to know since, but when you meet her for the first time, can be formidably intimidating. So we're in this elevator, and I just wanted to break the ice because the silence was awkward. And I blurted out the first question that came to my mind, which was, what operas have you seen recently? And I didn't even know that she was an opera fan, but of course she famously is and was. And that turned out to be exactly the right question. And she just opened up, and we began talking about her favorite operas throughout that term. And that began a lifelong conversation about music and the law that was one of the greatest blessings in my life.
And do you want to tell us about how you learned of her death, or is that too grim a place to?
No, I mean, if it was Rosh Hashanah, my dear God, we had just heard the Kaddish, and it was really a tough time because the National Constitution Center the night before had given her our Liberty Medal, which is an award that she had honored us by accepting, and we'd been working with her throughout the summer to assemble her favorite opera stars and special friends to offer tributes in words and music. And friends who are watching, please watch the video of this. You just Google the National Constitution Center Liberty Medal and Justice Ginsburg. It was beautifully produced by NBC. One of the impresario who helped put it together was Justice Ginsburg's daughter-in-law, Patrice Michaels, who's a great composer and singer. And Renee Fleming and Denise Graves and Gloria Steinem and her granddaughter. And it was just so agonizingly moving to have put on this video in tribute to her, which we conceived as a kind of personal Metropolitan Opera gala. That's what I wanted to give to her because I knew that was what she really wanted. And she, we don't know whether she was able to see it, but I believe that she was there in spirit. And for the video, she did issue a very beautiful statement that maybe I'll just read because it is her last public statement about how she wanted to be remembered. And Dahlia, you and I know that Justice Ginsburg chose words so carefully. Each word is important. So I'm going to read the statement, and then we haven't talked about it. I'm going to ask you what you think about it because she considered it very carefully. So here is Justice Ginsburg's statement accepting the National Constitution Center's Liberty Medal, and it was published the night before she died. Justice Ginsburg said, "It was my great good fortune to have had the opportunity to participate in the long effort to place equal citizenship stature for women on the basic human rights agenda. In that regard, I was scarcely an innovator. For generations, brave men and enlightened women in diverse nations pursued that goal, but they did so when society was not yet prepared to listen. I was alive and a lawyer in the late 1960s and the decade commencing in 1970. Conditions of life had so changed that audiences responded positively to pleas that society, men, women, and children, would be well served by removing artificial barriers blocking women's engagements in many fields of human endeavor, from bar membership to bartending, policing, firefighting, piloting planes, even serving on juries, helping to explain what was wrong about the closed door era was enormously satisfying. Dahlia, what do you make of that statement and what can we learn from it?
Wow. I hadn't heard it before, Jeff. It's elegiac. I mean, it's very much, it sounds like someone who certainly doesn't think the work is done. It sounds a little bit, tell me if I'm overreading this, as though she's saying, not only is the work not done, but people were more receptive then to some of these pleas than they are now. There's a strange way in which it sounds as though she's saying at the very end, someone else is going to have to finish this work. And I'm very struck. In my own obituary I wrote, I never heard Justice Ginsburg talk ever where she didn't say, I stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, at her confirmation hearings, she cited by name Harriet Tubman and Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton expressly said, but for them, I would not be here. And I never heard her not talk when she didn't cite the generation coming after. Mm-hmm. And there's something deeply Jewish to me about the idea of being a link in a chain, that she, for all the hype, and we're going to talk about the cultural icon thing, I think that sounds to me like a link in a chain kind of notice that the chain is going to have to continue on because I've taken it as far as I can go. Am I overreading?
No question about it. And whenever we talked, and our last conversation was in December 2019, our last public interview, she always cited her granddaughter's generation. And she said, that's what gives me hope. And she was so moved that her granddaughter was working for reproductive rights and was fighting battles on the state level. She always thought that political change came from the ground up, from politics, not from the top down, from judges. And it's so incredible to hear her granddaughter, Clara, in the Liberty Medal video, both talking about on a personal level what it was like to live with her grandmother, with Justice Ginsburg. She told one story about Justice Ginsburg was always thinking, and we both knew the remarkable silences that you had to get used to in conversation with her, because you'd be talking to her, you'd ask her a question, and there would be this long pause, and people who didn't know her would jump in to fill the awkward silence, as I did on the elevator. But you learn to sit back and wait in the silences, and then she comes up with something completely brilliant. And Clara told the story about how they were at the dinner table and Justice Ginsburg seemed lost in thought, and then she suddenly looked up and said, it's striking that in European countries, reproductive rights are covered by statute far more comprehensively than they are here. I'm so always thinking and so proud of her granddaughter for carrying on her legacy. And that question of whether she was optimistic or pessimistic, she always expressed optimism, including in our last interviews, because she was so heartened by young women and the young generation who she felt would carry forth her legacy.
I will tell you just this story, which I also, I think, put in my obituary that I wrote, which is that I got to sit down with her right before the court closed for COVID in January. And did a long interview that we can talk about. It was about her years at Harvard Law School. It had nothing to do with her legacy or any of the things you cover in your book. But I had a 20-year-old Slate staffer who was there because she'd done the research, and I felt that she should be in the room. And I describe in the obituary how Justice Ginsburg, I was like a plant, like a ficus in the corner. Her eyes were locked on Molly the entire time. And it was amply clear to me and everyone else in the room, there were 4 of us from our team, that every word she said that day for an hour was directed not at me, who was interviewing her, but at this 20-something staffer who she saw as the future. And I thought, to me, that was the most telling moment of that interview. I want to ask you, if I may, about the central puzzle you and I have worked through, which is, you know, the advice that her mother gave her: be independent, but also be a lady. And I want you to amplify what that meant to her, but I want to put it in the context of, someone sent me a meme yesterday, an RBG meme, in which the RBG had her fist raised, like a kind of, you know, power to the people. And there's a real kind of pop star, rock star version of RBG in which she is angry and sassy and a rapper. You know, that's the genesis of Notorious RBG. And I think you and I have talked before about how nothing could be further from the be a lady directive that she was given. And I wonder if you could talk a little about how she morphed culturally from this, I think, very ladylike, right to the end, dispassionate, brain in a vat, to this feminist icon of somebody who was full of anger and rippling with energy and power.
Yes, this was the central puzzle, because as we talked about the last time we convened, which was more than a year ago, Justice Ginsburg was the most present, self-disciplined, self-possessed, productive, and at the same time empathetic human being either of us has ever met. And I asked her over the years in the interviews that appeared initially in the book, you know, your mother gave you this advice about overcoming unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and remorse. Yes, she said. I said, but that, you know, that's the advice of the great wisdom traditions. It's central to the Talmud. Yes, she said. But it's very hard to achieve in practice. How do you do it? And she said, well, I realized if I don't do it, I'll lose precious time for productive work. And maybe this is the time, friends, to just share with you how astonishing her work ethic was. And I want to share a recent example. Dahlia knows that when I first gave her the manuscript for the book, she'd just recovered from a bout of cancer. This is in 2019. And I didn't know if she would be able to get to it. And 10 minutes after the Supreme Court term ended, she sent me an email saying, your manuscript is ready and I'll have it for you on Tuesday. And I showed up at the court and she handed me each page of the manuscript marked in her beautiful pencil. And I was stunned. I said, how did you have the time to do this? She said, well, I like to meet my deadlines. And I told you I would. But how did you actually do it? Well, in the back of cars or from the hospital or, you know, before an opera performance. But how, I wanted to know, you know, how was it actually possible? And the more recent example, the final interview, the 2019 interview, is in the paperback edition. So friends, that's why you got to buy the paperback, because it was the best interview we ever had, and it's in the paperback, which you can get. It's coming out November 3rd. And I sent her the transcript for that interview, and the publisher had said they wanted it. They gave me about a week. They said, get it on Friday. So I wrote to Justice Ginsburg on a Monday and said, you know, if you could get to this, that'd be great. If not, of course, no trouble. It was the only time she'd ever been cross with me, if not lost her temper. She fired back a fierce note saying, I am not sure I can get to this on Friday. This is a very short deadline. I forbid publication until I have approved it, and wait, I will let you know my wishes. I was mortified. She had just issued the dissenting opinion in the Wisconsin voting rights case, objecting to the artificial deadline the Supreme Court, in her view, had imposed on Wisconsin voters to turn in their ballots. So I said, I'm so sorry to bother. Please, of course, whenever, as much time as you need. 7:30 p.m. on that Friday, boom, the email comes back. Here is your edited manuscript. It's great. Very best wishes, or as she always signed it, with appreciation, RBG. The woman just was faster than everyone else, and she turned in her opinions faster than every other justice, even during this last term, because she was constantly working or thinking of others, writing thoughtful notes, like when my mom died, or to you, or rewriting the drafts of emails to her many fans. She was more productive and focused than anyone. So what was the secret? And I'm sorry to go on so long, Dahlia, but it's like the rosebud. We've been looking for the secret. In the December 2019 interview, I tried to press. I said, you say you don't want to lose time from productive work, but what was actually the source of this ability to focus? And she thought for a long time, and this is in the final interview. She said, it may have had something to do with my mother's death. My mother got ill with cancer right before, and died the day before I graduated from high school. And when she was ill, I learned to sit quietly on her bed doing my work. I didn't want to disturb her, so I felt like I should be completely focused on my work and meet her expectations by being as productive as possible. And if I had to get outside myself, I practiced the piano or the cello. But I remember sitting on her bed, and I said, that's just amazing. How did you combine that with this concern for others, an ability to feel their grief and empathy? And Dahlia, what she said then was, that may have had something to do with the fact that my sister died when I was very young. When I was less than 2 years old, my sister, who was 6 years old, died of meningitis because there was no sulfa drug at the time. And seeing the effect of my sister's death on my mother and my father, and feeling their grief, made me empathize with others and made me resolve to use every moment of my time to the best of my abilities to fulfill my mission and to serve others and to try to make the world a better place. It was really extraordinary. And of course, it's like a great musician or genius of a writer of any kind. It doesn't actually explain how she maintained that focus all the time and that complete self-possession. But those were the two answers she gave. So I asked them partly because I wanted to share them with you, because I knew we were both trying to figure out the answer. So what do you think of that? And what do you have to add to your view about how she was able to maintain that focus and empathy at the same time?
I mean, it's so beautiful, Jeff. And I hadn't heard either of those answers. And it does add a whole layer to the conversation you and I have had for a long time about where she put her anger. Because I could never understand how someone who just systematically in life was told, no, you can't do this, no, you can't have that. I'm sorry you're the top of your class, you don't get a clerkship. I'm sorry you're the top of your class, you don't get a position at a law firm. I'm sorry, throughout her life, I'm sorry, we have to fire you because you're pregnant. This was her life. And were it you, I would hazard, were it me, I will say for certain, I would be a seething ball of fury. And she just didn't, as you say, find that to be a useful way to spend her time. She just doubled down and worked harder. And I think there's something very beautiful about this image of what she had to do when her mother was ill, and think about how she had to do that again when Marty, her husband, was ill, where she would sit quietly, do all her work, did his work at Harvard Law School. She was doing all of his class notes and typing up all of his work. And there's something very profound and sad about sitting in stillness and actually carrying the world on your shoulders and feeling that there's something in that stillness that is a virtue. And I think it's sad just because of this moment we're in, Jeff, where everybody is screaming, everybody is dialed up to 12, that there's such a teaching in there about, and not be a lady, but how to hold the world and also not let it turn you into a monster, not let it turn you into a rage machine. I think it's really sublime.
It's completely sublime. And it really inspires and guides me every day, especially since she's passed and I've been grieving her, but even before. Whenever I, which happens 100 times a day, am surfing the web or watching cat videos, or or losing my temper. I think of that extraordinary woman bearing the weight of the world on her shoulders and ask, what would RBG do? And try to get back to work, or to get outside of myself in productive and elevating ways of connecting to the universal. So, I mean, just this afternoon before our talk tonight, whatever, a tough day at work, the usual stresses, Lauren and I, my wife, just decided to go out in the woods in beautiful Rock Creek Park and listen to Schubert, kind of, because that seemed like a really meaningful thing to do. And that practice, that discipline of, if you're not going to be working, don't get caught up in anger in the latest tweets or the latest political gossip, but use your time to connect to beautiful art and music, which RBG always said takes you outside of yourself, is so crucially important. It is the advice of the great wisdom traditions. I wondered, she was a proud Jew, and she talked, she had the quotation from Deuteronomy in her chambers, justice, justice shall that pursue. And Rabbi Holtzblatt's eulogy at the Supreme Court was incredibly on point. She noted that the Talmud says something like 12 times to remember the widow, orphan, and strangers. Thinking about the other, love thy neighbor as thyself, is the central tenet of the Talmud. But she ended with the injunction, and blessed be the true judge, the divine. Of course, I never discussed with Justice Ginsburg her spiritual beliefs. But the Talmud itself counsels us, especially in the prophets, to overcome anger with compassion, such a central emphasis. And it's also very stoic. I mean, I don't think she was especially steeped in the Greeks and Romans, but that idea of overcoming unreasonable passion with our powers of reason is straight out of Aristotle and Cicero. In any event, it's her legal and constitutional legacy will be unmatched in our lifetime. But just as a practical guide for how to live, I find myself thinking about her a whole lot. And if each of us can achieve, or I'll just say to you, friends in the audience, I'll speak personally. When I think I'm doing my best and I'm being really productive and focused and I've had a good day, multiply that by 10 or 20 or 100, and you'll begin to approximate the focus and productivity and empathy and compassion and devotion of Justice Ginsburg.
I wonder if you could talk a minute about, we haven't talked about the case as much, and I suspect some folks want to hear us talk about her judicial legacy, but I think maybe the way into that is that as I've been reflecting on Jewish influences on Justice Ginsburg, and I've done a few talks about it, so my thinking is evolving, because as you say, she was a bit of a cipher about it. We know she definitely grew up thinking about it. We know Holocaust refugees resettled around her had a profound effect on her worldview. But I had two theories of the case, and I wonder if maybe you can apply them to doctrine. One is, I think, Jeff, she always was acutely aware of being an outsider. And I think, she describes, driving by signs that said no dogs, no Jews on establishments as a child, and how much that affected her. And then I've talked about all the doors that were closed to her because of gender, because of Judaism. I think that there's something about being an outsider, and an outsider in America, that was deeply Jewish for her. And when she talked about why Jews were drawn to the law in America, she always said it's because they couldn't do a lot of jobs. And even within the legal profession, they couldn't take whatever specialty they wanted. There were some Jewish tasks that you were allowed to do, and there were some that were not. And I wonder if you think maybe the empathy you're describing, this uncanny ability she had to imagine herself into the shoes of the women who worked at Walmart, in that Walmart descent, into the shoes of Lily Ledbetter at Goodyear Tire, imagining herself time and again, into voters who had to stand in long lines because of vote suppression. That solicitude for the outsider, I think you're right, it comes from like ancient Torah roots. I also wonder if you think it seeps into her doctrine from this very Jewish experience of growing up in an America where she never quite was allowed in.
That's such a beautiful insight, and I think it is profoundly true, and I think you put it extremely well. That generation of brilliant, strong Jewish women felt like outsiders. My mom was born a month after Justice Ginsburg in 1933, also in Brooklyn. So it was the same generation. And also immigrants from Eastern Europe fleeing the pogroms, remembering the violence and murder that they were coming from, and working their way up from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn, which was a big step up, maybe then to the Bronx, was to feel an outsider. And even as she excelled using the American education system, these great public schools in New York, to be the very best, working harder than everyone else to be the top of her class at Cornell and Harvard Law School and Columbia, never taking anything for granted and always feeling like you had to break down the doors, and then experiencing that repeatedly, as you said, being turned down for a clerkship by Felix Frankfurter because he thought the court wasn't ready for a woman. By Learned Hand, the judge who also didn't want to have a woman, but she would drive, and they enjoyed Gilbert and Sullivan together. So all of the great confidence of culture and civilization and music and reading, these are her profound values. And she's just excelling better than anyone else, but never feeling in that generation like she was because she was the trailblazer. She was the first one to break down those barriers. And that's, that also brings us back to that statement and helps us understand how significant that was. Helping, Dahlia, I think you really put your finger on it, because now we can better understand her last sentence, helping to explain what was wrong with that closed door era, an era of artificial barriers blocking women's engagements in many fields of human endeavor. That's what she was experiencing constantly, closed doors, and her, through just working harder and being better and being more brilliant and also being more disciplined than everyone else, she helped to open them up. So there, I think you've really helped me understand a profound aspect of her in a new way.
Let's do one more question with you and I, and folks should put their questions in the Q&A and we will try to get to them. Jeff, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the things that Justice Ginsburg discussed with you that are really interesting. Are these contemporary questions around Me Too, about reproductive rights and how she would have done it differently if she were writing Roe v. Wade. Do you want to talk a little bit in this very freighted moment for women and the Constitution and the law, what she thought we were getting right as we journey onward, and what she thought were some potholes we want to avoid?
Yes, indeed. We talked about this most during one of the most sublime weekends I'll ever have, and you know the story. When I told her I wanted to collect our conversations over the years into a book, she said yes, and then she invited my wife Lauren and me, and she married us a few months earlier, to spend the weekend with her at the Glimmerglass Opera. Heaven on all levels, going to West Side Story and this modern piece with her, staying in a beautiful home with her and her family, and meeting Margaret Atwood, who was lecturing, and seeing the meeting between these two great women who discussed Me Too and their shared commitment to its salutary impacts in sensitizing men to the degrading and demeaning behavior, while at the same time expressing concern for due process and fairness rights of the accused, which in Margaret Atwood's case got her into some trouble, and Justice Ginsburg encouraged and supported her concern about procedural fairness for men and women. But after the opera, we were sitting at dinner, and she never gave me any notice for this one. She said, "Okay, we can have an interview if you like." So I just pulled out my iPhone and thought, "Gosh, what do I really need to ask her about?" And it was, "What's the unfinished business? Um, you achieved so much in terms of equal treatment, and what remains to be done?" And first she said unconscious bias, that was really her concern. And, prescient, given the discussion that has transfixed the nation about unconscious racial bias in the past months. But Justice Ginsburg continued to give the example of the blind audition at symphony orchestras, which she said showed that when women were able to compete with men without being seen, they needed or excelled the admissions. So she was very much in favor of structures of society that would prevent men from acting in ways based on their unconscious bias. She also wanted to see the ERA passed. And I asked her why, because she, in her Virginia Military Institute opinion, achieved much of what the Equal Rights Amendment would have achieved by requiring that gender discrimination be subject to judicial scrutiny nearly as skeptical as that of racial discrimination. But she thought it'd be really important for shoring up protections for reproductive rights. And on that score, it's worth noting at this moment, although we're not going to talk about contemporary politics, that I asked her then, as I'd asked her many times, "Do you think Roe v. Wade will be overturned?" And she said, "No, I do not. I am cautiously optimistic it will not be," but she thought it was all up to Chief Justice John Roberts, because she believed that the court was poised between four liberal justices who were determined to preserve it, and four conservatives who she suggested, without saying explicitly, might be willing to overturn it. And she thought that the chief's commitment to the institutional legitimacy of the court would mean that he would not want to see it overturned on his watch. Of course, that calculus entirely changes if you have a 6-3 court where the chief is no longer the swing vote and can't control the majority opinion. So that's worth noting. But she wanted an ERA because she thought that if Roe were cut back, if not overturned, and she expected it would be cut back, the burden would fall mostly on poor women. Women of means, she said, will still have the same access to abortion that they have now in states like New York and California and all those blue states. Nothing will change, because remember, friends in the audience, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it doesn't mean abortion is everywhere legal or illegal. It means each state can decide on its own whether it wants to protect choice or restrict it. So in the blue states, it would remain the same. But in the red states, where already there's very little access, and Justice Ginsburg always noted that in many of these states, there's already one clinic, and women have to travel halfway across the state to get there, which is difficult if you don't have means. Those clinics would be shut down entirely, meaning the only way for women in those states to exercise their right to choose would be to go out of state, and poor women couldn't do that. So she thought an ERA added to the Constitution, centrally viewing reproductive choice as a right of women's equality, not only privacy and dignity, would help shore those up. Those were two of her concerns, and she would not be happy about the situation we're facing now.
I wonder if we should take some questions, and I'm just reminding folks to put their questions into the chat, and Jeff and I will try to take them. And there's a nice question. Bonnie Lindauer asks, how did Justice Ginsburg influence her colleagues on the court during heated discussions? How did she stay outside of politics while serving on the court? And I think both Jeff and I could probably write a dissertation on both of those questions, but I will say she deeply believed that her role was to influence through her writing. She believed very, very deeply that her dissents were, maybe at some point, I think she stopped believing they were for her colleagues. I think she did believe when she started writing, in Hobby Lobby, in Shelby County, the Voting Rights Act case. She started writing dissents that the tone changed. Jeff has noted she suddenly wasn't quoting other people as much. She had these very clever little analogies she started using. So something shifted when I timestamp it to when she became the only woman on the court after Sandra Day O'Connor left. And she really didn't like being the only for all the reasons Jeff laid out at the beginning, because she started her life as the only. And it was very hard, having been one of two women at the court, to go to being the only. But I think one of the things she did, and this is so important, and I'm glad, Bonnie, that you asked the question, because it gives me a chance to say that I think Justice Ginsburg never gave up on allyship. And she particularly never gave up on male allyship. And it's really important. I think it's of a piece with what Jeff and I were talking about in terms of not losing your temper, not burning bridges, never saying something that would forever irreparably damage a potential allyship. And so one of the things she did was just never give up on these friendships. And whether it was the deep friendship she had with Justice Scalia, that she would never give up on, even when he wrote inexcusable things sometimes about Sandra Day O'Connor, he wrote very, very harshly. She found a way back to him. And she certainly, I think, deeply influenced Chief Justice Rehnquist in the Family Medical Leave Act case. So much so, I think, that she likes to tell the story of how Marty teased her that she had written that majority opinion in the Family Medical Leave Act case. It didn't sound like Rehnquist. She very much influenced Anthony Kennedy in the abortion cases, where he went from writing one way to writing profoundly different and thinking different and voting differently. So I think she really used what Jeff is sort of describing, this soft power of persuasion and this soft power of allyship to get what she wanted. And I think in some ways, sometimes she was successful, in later years less so, but I think it was not deployed to burn things down or to make a huge splash. I think she was just chipping away and hoping that in every enemy there could be an ally. And it really seems, again, very unfashionable in an era where we all just want to set each other on fire. But I think that was one of her superpowers, was that even in the most strident disagreement, she didn't give up on the possibility that she could turn someone around.
Oh, that is so well said. And her friendship with Justice Scalia is exactly the right thing to note. And of course, she loved to tell that story, which is now famous, about the advice her mother gave her on her wedding day. Her mother-in-law, rather, Marty's mother, said, "The secret to a good marriage, sometimes it helps to be a little deaf." She would always pause for the laugh and then say, "Advice I have often used in my current job." And what she meant by that, it wasn't immediately obvious when I heard the line the first time, is if there's an unkind word that's said, just tune it out, pretend it didn't happen, and let it pass so that you can maintain a relationship. She had a remarkable ability to do that, just not to answer questions that she didn't want to. You'd be with her, and we were touring the Hamilton exhibit of his pistols and so forth. And I don't know what I asked her. I think it was how she liked the musical, actually. And she just pretended she hadn't heard that, but then she volunteered that although she liked Hamilton, the founder, her favorite founder was Madison, so she would answer what she wanted to. And the Scalia-Ginsburg friendship is really important because they loved each other. And you know what to me is amazing about that friendship? So after Bush v. Gore, she was furious. And I know that because I talked to her, and I think I can share, I'm going to, that, she both made it clear that she thought it was an outrage, and I'd written the angriest piece I ever wrote for the New Republican called Disgrace, and she signed the cover, for your souvenir. She thought it was completely outrageous. And I wondered what her relationship with Scalia would be after that. But then at his memorial service, she told the story about how after Bush v. Gore, she was sitting there in the court seething, and he called her up and said, "Ruth, what are you still doing at the court? You should go home and take a hot bath." Good advice, she said, that I promptly followed. So she just didn't allow her constitutional disagreements to interfere with personal civility because of her devotion to the institution of the court. And that's another thing that's so important to talk about now in this dreadfully anxious moment when the legitimacy of the court itself may be under siege. Her and Justice Scalia's shared commitment to the court as an institution and to the rule of law, and the fact that, as she put it, he makes me crack up. He drives me crazy, but he makes me crack up, which he did, that maintain that friendship. This doesn't mean that she was a compromiser. Justices Breyer and Kagan were much more likely to forge moderate compromises with Chief Justice Rehnquist than Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor, who often would be alone in 7-2 dissents in cases involving the separation of church and state, for example. But she was extraordinarily kind and civil, and it was really striking to see the tributes of her fellow justices. Justice Neil Gorsuch just talked about how kind she was to him when he joined the court. She brought to him the law clerk manual that she had given to Justice White 20 years ago. He had returned it to her, and she gave it back to him. It was something like that. It was an incredibly thoughtful thing to do. And Justice Clarence Thomas was almost effusive in his public statement about how kind, how civil, how she never lost her temper, how gracious and thoughtful she was. People really loved her. And again, friends, just to reiterate this, this was not this is the opposite of a backslapping person. She was kind of like the queen. I mean, you didn't touch her or even address her except in a meaningful, focused, substantial way. But she was just so tuned in and so thoughtful that she was extraordinarily effective. I guess I should pick one question and answer it, and then ask you what you think, Dahlia. Well, it's a little technical, but it's important. So Peggy Forma asks, why did she have reservations about how Roe v. Wade was written? If written how she wanted it to be, would what is happening today still happen? It's a great question, Peggy, and here's the thing. Justice Ginsburg agreed with the result in Roe. She thought that the extreme Texas law that the court struck down in 1973 should have been struck down because it had no exceptions, including for the life of the mother. But what she objected to was the breadth of Roe, that it also went on to propose a complicated 3-trimester regulation system, which said that you could have more regulations as pregnancy advanced, and also the constitutional grounding of Roe in a right to privacy, because she thought that it was gendered to focus on the privacy of male doctors with their supposedly vulnerable women patients and the need for confidentiality. That's not what's at stake in abortion. She would have rooted protections for abortion in women's equality. And she argued a case called the Susan Struck case back in 1971, which said that restrictions on abortion impose burdens on women that are not imposed on men, chiefly forcing them to carry children against their will and requiring them to enlist their bodies in this act, which will divert the choice of their careers, thereby denying them the equal opportunity to choose their life's paths that men have. And the court recognized that to some degree in the Casey case, where it talked of women's equality as well as dignity and privacy. How would things be different? I believe, she argued, and I agree with her, that had Roe been decided more narrowly, just striking down that Texas law without presuming to really strike down the majority of all the regulations that were on the books at the time, the political process may have run its course. She argues that states like New York and others were on the verge of liberalizing their abortion laws, and if they'd had a little more time, they would have done so on their own, and therefore the backlash against Roe might not have happened. You wouldn't have had the mobilization of the pro-life movement. You wouldn't have had every Supreme Court confirmation since Roe turning into a referendum on Roe, and because a majority of the country, she noted, the polls since '73 have been pretty similar. 2/3 of the country supports some forms of choice early in pregnancy, and a similar supermajority supports restrictions on choice later in pregnancy. She thinks that that moderate compromise, which is also shared in Europe, would have been written into law politically. And she believes that inequality rationale would have been less vulnerable constitutionally and might have been more enduring. Some disagree with her. It was a contested position, but I think she was right. Dahlia, what do you think in retrospect? And do you think it would have made any difference if Roe was decided differently?
Well, I think she was right. I think she was prescient. I think that she always felt that rather than locating Roe in this penumbra, privacy, substantive due process analysis, that had it been planted in the fertile soil of equality, if we had started in 1973, in addition, I think you're right, to the very, very narrow ruling just about Texas, but also if we had said women cannot be equal in America unless they can control their reproductive lives. And for her, that was a given. And that was as urgent and as immediate as Jeff notes, this very paternalistic right that is located in a woman's relationship with her always male physician in the writing of Roe v. Wade. And so I think she was a visionary. She said she would have located it elsewhere. It would have been more broadly understood to be a component of basic equality. She made that point over and over again in doctrine. That's how she thought about contraception, by the way. So I think what is ironic to me, Jeff, is that, and I think you and I have both told this story, but it's worth flagging, by the time Bill Clinton taps her for the US Supreme Court, the women's movement in America thought she was a fossil. They thought she was, first of all, they thought she was dead wrong on Roe and that she didn't support it with sufficient enthusiasm, but they also thought that her brand of 70s feminism, the ways that she brought those landmark cases, was small ball, it was not ambitious, it was not nearly visionary enough, it was very upper middle class and not intersectional. And we forget, because in this third act of her life, when she becomes a feminist icon, and everybody has the mug and the t-shirt, look, I'm wearing the dissent earrings. But we forget that the women's movement thought her time had come and gone. And part of the basis of that was that they felt that she wasn't sufficiently loyal to Roe. And I think we're both saying in different ways, part of the reason Roe stands on shaky ground in 2020 is that it was not planted in the fertile ground she would have located it in 1973.
Well, it was in retrospect, unfathomable opposition of some women's groups to her nomination that led to my footnote role in her nomination, which I talk about in the book. After I met her in the elevator, I went on to the New Republic magazine, and as a young, extremely overconfident 28-year-old journalist, I was presumed to rank all of the Supreme Court candidates who were supposed to replace Justice Byron White, who just retired. And she was not on the top of the list or anywhere near it, partly because of the opposition of women's groups who didn't like her opposition to Roe. So I wrote this piece called The List. I told a story, which she later told at Justice Scalia's funeral, that I'd been talking to the law clerks in the DC circuit a few weeks earlier, and someone asked, and Justice Scalia was there, and someone asked him, if you had to be trapped on a desert island for the rest of your life with Lawrence Tribe or Mario Cuomo, who were the two frontrunners, who would you choose? And he said, without missing a beat, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then she noted, soon after, the president chose me. But what happened was, I later learned from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that he had been flying with Clinton, and he said, I just read your New Republic piece, and Clinton asked me, who should I appoint? And I said, there's just one choice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Clinton famously said, the women are against her. And Moynihan had the wit to fax, this is 1991, a letter to David Gergen, where the dean of Harvard Law School called Justice Ginsburg the Thurgood Marshall of the women's movement. And that helped, along with that piece, he said, bring her over the edge. And she credited it and many other unsolicited testimonies to her for, having some role in bringing her over the finish line. So it's just an incredible sign of how far we've come. In 1991, Justice Ginsburg, viewed as a judge's judge, thought to be too conservative by some liberals who feared that she wasn't fiery enough, and actually opposed by some women's groups, having, I won't say morphed, but apotheosized not only into the notorious RBG, because although that was a, memorable part of her pop culture celebrity, it doesn't begin to do justice to the magnitude and significance of her historic role as the constitutional visionary. And maybe we should wrap up in a sec. I'll share that Lauren and I went to grieve her, of course, when her body was lying at the Supreme Court, just outside the court. And it was draped in a flag and flanked by two of her law clerks and a military guard. And looking up at her, in addition to feelings of sadness and grief and loss, just feeling awestruck by the magnitude of her historical achievement. She inscribed herself onto history by sheer force of will. This young girl from the Bronx and Brooklyn, just as you said, Dahlia, an outsider, broke down every door, fearless, because that was her mission. And now she's belongs to history. And we were so lucky to know her. So Dahlia, last word to you, but it's so meaningful to grieve her with you. Such awful times ahead. And she would not have liked any of it because she valued the institution of the court above all. But it's so meaningful to take this moment to grieve her and remember how lucky we were to have known this special friend and great hero, Justice Ginsburg.
Jeff, so I'm sorry for your loss. I cannot imagine what you and Lauren are suffering. Cannot imagine what her family is suffering. I know what the country is suffering. I've seen it, and I have been moved by it. Someone that I don't know had dinner sent to me tonight to thank me. So this is how everyone wants to be involved. I will say this as my last word because I think it's a very Jewish thing. And I've been, as I say, sitting and reflecting, Jeff, on one thing I got wrong about RBG when I used to talk about her. And I'm sure everybody who's watching knows that in the arc of the cases that she brought at the ACLU Women's Rights Project, she represented men. She would find men who were victims of gender discrimination in the law because they were carved out of Social Security benefits, carved out of tax benefits, carved out of survivor benefits, whatever they were. She said, I will bring cases on behalf of men, not women. And I always told that story as a sort of party trick. Look how clever she was. She was talking to panels of 3 male judges on the appeals courts, 9 male judges on the Supreme Court. She had to bring male plaintiffs because they wouldn't have cared if women were suffering because they thought they were protecting women. They thought they were chivalrous. Jeff, it wasn't a party trick. It was a deeply beautiful thing. And when I look back only in the last 2 weeks on how she loved those men, she loved the men who wanted to stay home and take care of their mothers and couldn't get benefits. They wanted to stay home and take care of their children when they were widowers and they couldn't get benefits. She loved those men. She stayed in touch with them, her entire life. Why? Because I didn't understand it wasn't a party trick. She believed that she was liberating men from gender barriers as much as she was liberating women. And she believed that everyone could be Marty Ginsburg. Everybody could be the guy who helped with the homework and helped with the cooking and was probably a little bit emotionally more prepared to deal with children. She freed men in this country. And I kind of wrote it off for most of her career as like, oh, look how clever she was. Of course they were going to side with the boys who wanted to drink the near beer. No. She worked to make men as free to have a multifaceted, complicated life as women. And I want to credit her with that in closing, only because I think it's a beautifully Jewish notion that we get to be fully realized. And I think it's important. But I also think it's important because I really think for all the people who are questioning, how do we go forward? I'm so angry. I don't know how to think about the future. RBG was not a zero-sum feminist. She was a feminist because she believed that she was freeing men to be feminists too and making us all equal. And I want to end there only because I'm a little sad I didn't say that to her in her lifetime. I think I am raising 2 teenage boys and married to a total equal partner. I think she made that world possible too.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Dahlia. Thank you, friends, for watching. Well, thanks to the Almighty for having given us RBG.
On behalf of Jewish Book Council and our JBC Network partners, thank you so much to both of you, Jeff and Dahlia, for this truly incredible conversation. We're so grateful to you for taking the time to be with us this evening. Please remember to purchase a copy of Conversations with RBG. You can find a link in the chat, and we look forward to seeing you for future virtual Jewish literary programs. Shana Tova.